In question 1, we're given 9 different scenarios where we're asked to define whether they're an example of a real shock or an aggregate demand shock. A real shock is defined as any shock that increases or decreases the potential growth rate. If we're looking at a graph, it is basically a shock that moves the long run supply curve or aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right, whereas an aggregate demand shock is one that moves the aggregate demand curve. It's rapid and unexpected. So first one, let's fall on the price of oil. That is a real shock. Supply is being shifted. Technically, the price of oil is being shifted, so the supply will also be shifted as well. So it's a real shock. A rise in consumer optimism. That is an aggregate demand shock. The demanders / the consumers' optimism are changing. A hurricane that destroys factories in Florida. The weather is changing and the supply is decreasing, so it's a real shock. Good weather that creates a bumper crop of California oranges. It's an opposite of the hurricane that destroyed factories, so it's also a real shock. A rise in sales taxes are a real shock. Foreigners who watch fewer U.S.-made movies is a real shock. The producers will realize that they're going to make fewer movies to accommodate this, so the supply will be shifted. Fear is with the consumer, so it's an aggregate demand shock. A new invention is occurring at a faster pace than usual. The supply is changing, so it's a real shock. And a fast money growth rate is an aggregate demand shock. In question 2, we're asked 3 questions based on figure 32.2. How many recessions have there been since World War II? If we count the number of lines in the graph, we see that there are 11 recessions. And the second question asks, since World War II, how many recessions have unemployment rates of over 10? All of them did. So 11 again. And part C, often the unemployment rate sees a peak after the recession ends. The economy goes back. Or as the recessions of 1990 and 2001 have been clear examples of these jobless recoveries. Approximately how many times did the unemployment rate peak after the recession ended? After each recession, it peaked once and then it went back down. In question 3, we are asked to look at figure 5. When inflation rises, does the solo growth rate rise, fall, or remain unchanged? Well, if we look at it, at the curve, it is basically a vertical line. So even as the inflation rate changes, the solo growth rate does not change at all. In question 4, we're asked, are real shocks just negative shocks by definition? No. A real shock, as defined as before, is one that shifts the long-running aggregate supply curve. So it could be a positive shock or a negative shock. Basically, it could increase or decrease the potential rate of the countries. Though we don't see that many positive shocks, it doesn't mean they aren't possible.
Question 5 asks us about what happens to the long-run aggregate supply curve when a real shock hit. So here it's going to shift to the left because in this case the shock is negative. Question 6 asks what happens to the aggregate demand curve when a negative shock hits, and it just stays the same. Real shocks mostly impact the growth curve, which affects the long-run supply curve, not the aggregate demand one. And then moving on to question 7, we know that the long-run aggregate supply curve in the United States is about 3%. So if there's a negative 2% shock that hits it, the resultant curve is going to be about 1%. This does not mean that the U.S. is in a recession by any means. A drop of 2% could still be a big deal, but the growth is still positive, and we don't know how long this lasts, so we can't classify it as a recession without any more information. So I'm recording Brandon's for now because his audio got messed up and was unusable, but he did the work here. So for question 8, we're asked what a negative shock does to inflation. So because a negative shock shifts the long-run aggregate supply curve to the left and decreases the real growth, inflation, which is also on the right side of the equation, along with real growth, must increase to compensate. Part B then asks what that negative shock will do to spending growth. Now, this remains unchanged, as only the solo growth curve shifts to the left, which decreases real growth and increases inflation. And for part C, we're asked what a fall in spending growth does to real growth, and the answer is again nothing, for the same reason as the previous question. Moving to question 9, we know that when expected inflation is less than actual inflation, real growth will rise because the money is worth a little less and needs to increase to compensate. So applying that, when expected inflation is 5% and actual inflation is 7%, real growth rises. At 3% and 1%, it falls. At 6% and 6%, it's unchanged because they are the same. At 7% and negative 10%, it falls, and at negative 1% and 2%, it rises. And for question 10, when looking at the graph, we can see that using the equation x plus 1% equals 7% from the given numbers, x must be equal to 6%. And for part B, if the spending growth were 15% and the growth rate is fixed, we're asked to find inflation. So the inflation rate is equal to aggregate demand minus the long-run aggregate supply. So we're going to come out with around 14% as our inflation rate in this economy.
In question 11, we're looking at two different ways to look at the shift in short-run aggregate supply curve, or the SRAS curve. So when inflation is greater than what people expect, the curve eventually shifts up, and when the inflation is less than people's expectation, the curve will shift down. Likewise, instead of saying when inflation is greater than expectation or lower than expectation, you can say when real GDP growth is above the solo growth, and the same would happen, so the curve would shift left, and when the GDP growth is below the solo growth rate, SRAS, shifts right. These two are equivalent statements, and they describe the same process because, as we've seen in previous labs, a shift to the left is a shift up, and a shift to the right is a shift down. And essentially, when the inflation is higher than people's expectations, we see a real growth rate that is higher than the solo growth rate. So the two conditions translate into each other. For question 12, we said that with a real shock, when real growth is worse than usual, the inflation is higher than usual. And conversely, with an aggregate demand shock, when real growth is worse than usual, inflation will be lower than usual. Next up, we have question 14, where we're asked about the shift of a short-run labor supply curve when there is a decrease or a fall in the demand for labor. So just to clear things up, we define pay cuts as a reduction in employee's salary, and since the question states that a fall in labor demand exists, that means fewer workers are needed. Now, they will be subjected to less pay, but since they will refuse that, even in the expense of losing their jobs, we expect to see workers losing their jobs. Now, on the graph, we've shown our shifted short-run labor supply curve. This fall in labor demand will create a surplus of workers because there are more workers than needed. And according to the basic supply and demand model, we see that whenever there is a surplus, so here's the labor surplus, we expect to see a drop in the goods price. So in this case, the employee will get a lower salary.